It's nice to speak with you today, Jonah. And today we're going to discuss trends in supply chain software. Before we start, can you provide a brief background of yourself?
Sure, Dustin. Thanks again for the invite. Really been looking forward to talking to you about this. So by way of introduction, I'm a supply chain technologist. My career has been at the confluence of running operations and software. So on the operations side, I helped run major retail supply chains. And on the software side, I've worked with solution providers as a consultant and product manager and so forth. And then in the last 5 years, I've been orientating really towards entrepreneurship. And in 2013, I was able to sell a company I started that was a SaaS transportation planning business to GP Nexus. And now I'm currently launching a new business in the supply chain space.
Interesting. And what trends do you see that are happening in the supply chain software space?
Well, there's a lot. I think the advances in computer engineering and software are and almost always have been driven from outside of our field, outside of supply chain. So if you look for the last 20 years, supply chain software has basically been riding the incredible advance of computing power and know-how that's going on from outside our field. So that's not changing. But there are some important trends that I see in supply chain that are kind of well on their way in consumer tech or in other spaces that I think are going to cross over pretty soon. So I guess a couple of them I would mention. One of them is this mindset around mobile first. So if you look at consumer tech businesses such as Uber, they really start from day one with the mobile app and the mobile device as the primary touch point for these. And so that changes not just kind of the look and feel of the device, but also assumptions about how much time you can spend training the user and what the user might be doing besides using that software. You know, are they in a busy environment? Do they have a lot of time to focus on the task, or does it have to be very simple and short? I think supply chain software really traditionally gone the other direction. They've come from the assumption that the user works in the company and they're kind of dedicated to that software, and they can be trained, and they use a big screen computer. So they don't even have most of them don't have a mobile touch point at all, or if they do, it's been added as an afterthought. So I expect that we're going to see a lot of supply chain software tools that get launched now or in the future, in the near future, that have mobile app as their primary or only touch point. I think one of the people to watch in this space is Elementum. They're kind of a hot. Sorry about that. Not sure what happened.
My next question is, what trends do you see in the supply chain software space?
Yeah, so I see a few that might be of interest. So for the last 20 years, I see supply chain software as being pushed ahead by this sort of wave of advanced computing power and know-how and engineering talent that comes from outside the field. Right? So I don't think that's going to change. I think that still the advances in computing engineering and software are mostly going to be driven outside of supply chain, and that supply chain just gets to pick and choose and borrow from those. So I think the most important trends to watch for always in supply chain software are going to be the ones that are starting and proven in other places, like consumer tech or someplace else. So just a few that I would mention. One is mobile first. This idea that you're going to build your solution, your software application, with a basis of a mobile user and a mobile app as the starting point. So I think if you see consumer tech businesses such as Uber, they begin with this assumption that my users out moving around, they don't have a lot of time, they need quick, highly usable applications on their phone that are easy to learn. You don't have a lot of time to train the user, right? And supply chain software has traditionally come from the other side, where there's this assumption that the software is in a company, therefore they have a lot of time to train all the users, and the users can get set up, and they're using a desktop computer and all that goes along with that, right? So I expect that in the very near future, we're going to see more and more software tools that are launched, probably mostly by new coming participants, not incumbents, which take mobile first seriously, so that as a primary or only touch point with the user is their mobile device. And I think Elementum, which is this sort of hot new startup in the supply chain visibility space, is really embracing this strategy. So they've started mobile first mostly. I think a second place to look for that's an interesting trend is microservices. So again, if you look in consumer tech, but also infrastructure as a service, if you look at in those categories, the mindset's been switching from building like monolithic software that can do everything, but also has to do everything, to building these little microservices that get kitted together using open APIs to form a bespoke solution as needed, and can be started and killed sort of minute by minute or hour by hour. And when I look at that compared to, and so I think Amazon and Docker and Swagger, these are kind of all examples of this technology in play. But if I look at supply chain software, it really seems to be in the last throes of this drive to build cohesive single provider platforms. So it's really, the mindset is pretty much on the opposite end of the spectrum from microservices. But I think that's going to change. I suspect there's going to be a shift in focus. So instead of having one big solution which can kind of do everything for your supply chain, and not just for yours, but maybe for everyone's supply chain, I think there's going to be a shift over to a lot of small solutions that can be like easily and obviously integrated. So as an example, instead of having a TMS or WMS that has tons of capabilities inside of it, you'd have a lot of collections of little capabilities which are easy to put together. And therefore you can stitch them together to make your own kind of super system in a really intuitive way. So I think the last trend I mentioned is, and I know that it sounds a bit crazy to talk about artificial intelligence and machine learning, but we have Siri on our phones now, on our iPhones. We have driverless cars that are going into mass production. So it just seems so that I would think that's important for supply chain software as a space would be machine learning. And I know it sounds a bit crazy when people talk about machine learning or artificial intelligence, but if you look at other spaces, so if you look at mobile phones that have things like Siri for iPhone, if you look at driverless cars, which are going into mass production, it just seems obvious that supply chain as a space can benefit from machine learning. So to give an example, if you look at most supply chain software, one of the challenges that they have is bringing the user's attention to the things that are exceptional, so that they can focus kind of their time and energy on what needs to be, what's not routine, what needs their attention, and not spend too much time just on the flood of transactions which is going through the supply chain. Well, that's actually pretty similar to something like a Facebook feed or a news aggregator, where you've got this flood of signal, you've got this flood of transactions, and you need some intelligence to adaptively figure out what's most important to that user and get it up in front of them sort of at the top of their feed. So I think that's just an example. People don't realize that's machine learning, but it is. It's adaptive. It's taking in a lot of data and coming up with a sort of hypothesis of how to act on it, and then looking at the results of that hypothesis once it takes action. So I think those three, just to sort of recap, the mobile-first approach, the microservices, and machine learning, those are probably the three most important trends I see in supply chain software space, in the sort of medium term anyway.
And what are some of the related other near-term moves of interest?
Yeah, so the three I described, I think, are interesting in the, let's say, like 5 to 10 year range, which is important for people who are making. I think there's a lot of decisions that people are making in that 5 to 10 year range where they need to be aware of this. But if you look more at sort of 0 to 5 years, I think there's going to be, I guess the most important trend I see would be a general crossover of consumer tech expertise over to supply chain. And so when I say consumer tech, I mean people leaving companies like Google and Yahoo and Apple and Airbnb and Uber and going towards supply chain. And they may approach it, they may go to supply chain and any of the sort of subfields underneath it. So that might be international trade compliance, it might be sourcing, it might be production planning, whatever. But I think that there's a lot of expertise coming from consumer tech that has low-hanging fruit applicability in supply chain. So things like design and engineering, and also just generally the management style of a software company. How do you manage a software company? That, and the financing of startups. Those are all things that are better done in consumer tech than in software. Supply chain software. And therefore, there's a lot of room for people who have the capabilities in that space to move over to our space. So if you look at, just sort of back this up, if you look at like Y Combinator data, one of the incubators, a famous incubator called Y Combinator, published some data earlier this year, and they show, among other things, they show sort of what are the keywords of things that are being funded or incoming startup concepts by year over the last 10 years, and you can see that things like logistics and transportation were just not present 10 years ago, and now they are. I think that there's another reason why this is particularly attractive for consumer tech companies to move into supply chain and other enterprise spaces is because they're seeing companies like Workday and the success that they have by applying basic software design principles to enterprise software, because enterprise software, the users are just, they're always dealing with these antiquated screens that are not very fun to use, not very easy to use. And so just a little bit of the consumer tech kind of thinking there goes a long way. And finally, enterprise spaces like supply chain software spaces, they're not as large as consumer tech in terms of overall spending, but they don't have the winner-take-all mentality or sort of winner-take-all dynamics that consumer tech has. So you can be like number 2 or 3 in supply chain software and still make good money, whereas in consumer tech, there's a pretty steep cliff between being number 1 and number 2. So I think there's more willingness to fund supply chain startups software startups in the supply chain space. So I think in the near term, in the 0 to 5 years term, the answer would be, it's an inflow of consumer tech expertise over to supply chain. And really, it's only going to take one of those kind of companies to succeed at the levels like an Uber or Twitter or Airbnb to alter the industry to its core. Because as soon as you have one example of success, that draws in all the other hungry fish who want to take a stab at getting their own market territory there. So I imagine first one that succeeds totally changes the industry.
And thanks for sharing today, Jonah, on the trends in supply chain software.
No problem, Dustin. Really appreciate the invitation for me to speak with you and to get this out to your listeners.